Hey, it's Dr. Mike T. Nelson here, back with another edition of the Flex Diet Podcast. Man, we are getting all protein uber nerdy in this episode with PhD student Eric Williamson of Unlocked Fitness. So we talk all about protein metabolism. We even dive deep into some of the research that he is doing on protein metabolism, how it's done, what are some of the pros and cons of this research. And then at the very end, we do get into some practical tips for you. Try to sprinkle a few of those in as we go in terms of how much protein do you really need, what are some considerations with aging. And then we talked also about protein and fasting. So if you're doing some type of intermittent fasting, is all the muscle going to fall off your body? What are the changes with protein kinetics and metabolism that happen in relation to fasting? And it was just a super fun conversation. He's very up to date on all the research. He even shared with us a little bit of upcoming unpublished research that'll be out in a few months. So a little bit of background on Eric Williamson. Like I said, he is the owner of Unlocked Fitness. He's currently a PhD student at the University of Toronto. So you'll hear us kind of yammering on a little bit about academic trees and where people came from. He has a master's in exercise nutrition and metabolism from the University of Toronto. He did his undergrad specializing in nutrition and dietetics at Western University. And he is also a precision nutrition level 1, level 2, many other certifications there, both in exercise physiology and on the nutrition side. He was also the recipient of the Gatorade Sports Science Institute and the ACSM, so American College of Sports Medicine, Young Investigator Award. So that's pretty awesome. So overall, just a super knowledgeable dude. We had a really great time chatting here about protein. And if you want to know even more about protein, check out the Flex Diet certification. I've got a whole intervention about protein. And even in this interview, I asked him about one of the main concepts I use in there. And he did agree that it's still valid. So that's good. Would have been interesting if it wasn't. But I've got a whole intervention on protein, and then I've got interviews from Dr. Stu Phillips, Dr. Jose Antonio, and that's just one of 7 other interventions you can use to get better body composition and performance. And especially if you're a trainer, to teach a system of nutrition to your clients. So go to flexdiet.com. There'll be a way to get onto the wait list there the next time it's open. That'll put you onto the daily newsletter where I have a ton more of free information all the time there for you. Flexdiet.com, FLEXDIET.com. Enjoy this protein geeky conversation with Eric from Unlocked Fitness. Hey, what's going on? Welcome to the Flex Diet Podcast. I'm here with Eric Williamson of Unlock. It's Unlock Fitness, correct? Did I get that right?
That's right, Unlocked Fitness and Nutrition.
All right, awesome. And we're going to be talking all things about protein, getting a little geeky on different methods of looking at protein and some fasting. Maybe we'll talk about some other topics too. So thank you so much for being here, Eric. I really appreciate it.
Oh, thanks so much for having me, Dr. Mike.
Yeah. So for listeners who may not have heard of you, give us a little the short background on yourself.
All right, well, my journey kind of starts prior to my undergraduate degrees, where I found myself very interested in this area, struggling with fitness myself. Then went to university to study both nutrition and kinesiology. I got a BSc in nutrition and a BA in kinesiology. While I was there in my second year, I started volunteering with Dr. Peter Lemon in
Yeah.
his exercise nutrition lab, and I know that you know that name from being Lonnie Lowry's supervisor, as well
Yeah.
as
I
many
think he
others.
was John Barty's supervisor too, if I remember right, correct?
Yeah, exactly. And
Yeah.
of course, John Berardi has had an influence on my career choice
Sure.
as well,
He's the
and has
man.
been a great role model for me. but got involved in a lab at that time, and then towards the end of my degrees, also started getting involved in coaching with a guy named Graham Thomas, who I know has also been on the Iron Radio podcast.
Mm-hmm.
Following that, I did my dietetic internship to become a registered dietitian. After that, went on to do my Master of Science in Exercise, Nutrition, and Metabolism, so in the Exercise Science Department at University of Toronto, and then continued right into my PhD. I'm now going into just starting the 4th year of my PhD at the University of Toronto.
Awesome. And then for people listening who, I always like asking we did some of the academic tree questions already, but who is your advisor?
My advisor now is Dr. Daniel Moore, and
Cool.
we study primarily protein metabolism, a lot of other things related to exercise and sports nutrition as well.
Yeah, and I think his advisor was Dr. Stu Phillips from McMaster, correct?
That is correct. Yes.
Yeah.
We're very, very tight with that lab. We've had a few fun hangouts with the McMaster lab and some COVID video hangouts as well during the past summer.
Yeah,
It was good to see Stu.
I'm bummed. I was supposed to see Stu at a conference down here in March, but obviously that didn't happen. So, yeah.
Yeah, it's the one downside of this COVID. Well, I mean, multiple downsides, but certainly missing out on those conferences. I miss them as well.
Yeah. So how did you get into the world of protein metabolism?
Well, actually, in my undergraduate career, I was very fascinated by the science coming out of Stu Phillips' lab.
Yeah.
And I started following it really closely. I've been interested in resistance training for a long time, personally. I do it myself, and I've always been trying to gain muscle mass. The endless pursuit of it, I would say. And when I saw Daniel Moore's research, and then I saw that he was becoming an advisor at the University of Toronto, I put my application in there. I met with both Dr. Phillips and Dr. Moore. The big city, of course, interested me as well, and Dan has this brand new nice lab there, so that's how I found myself in that lab. We really connected, and I'm really happy with my choice. Not to say that Stu Phillips' lab wouldn't have been awesome as well, but certainly it's been an excellent experience at Dr. Daniel Moore's lab.
Yeah, and Toronto's a great city. I mean, I've been there a couple times. I think the last time I was there, a good buddy of mine, Jeff Gervais, runs Bank Fitness, so I was there. I always hang out and harass him, and I crashed the precision nutrition potluck they had and shocked John Berardi in line and just went up and went, "Hey, how's it going?" He's like, "What are you doing here?" I got
really
to hang
cool.
out with them, so that was always a good time when I'm there.
Awesome. Yeah, I've been to Bank Fitness a few times myself. Cool
Yeah,
gym.
great place. If anyone in Toronto looking for a place to train, highly recommend it. So, yeah, Toronto's great. A bunch of people I know live there, so very cool. So if we get down to some of the very cool topics you're looking at here, so for listeners who maybe aren't up to date on all the fancy protein techniques and all the stuff you guys are doing, the new methods, can you give us just kind of a short primer about, from the mechanistic standpoint, one, what are kind of the main things you look at, and why the hell should we care?
All right. Well, we look. Our lab primarily looks at muscle protein metabolism, and muscle is certainly a very important tissue for our longevity and for what I'm sure many of your listeners are interested in, which is performance.
And the gains,
Physical
man.
Performance. Exactly, and the gains. So it's become apparent, especially in recent years, how critical it is for our longevity and for reducing our risk of disease and debilitation as we age. And then we also look a little bit at whole body protein metabolism as well. In the starting years of the lab, and I've been there since Dan's 3rd year of having the lab, so pretty close to the beginning. We were using the indicator amino acid oxidation technique a fair bit. which is looking at whole body metabolism. And the way that that does so is through ingestion of an amino acid tracer, as we call it. It's a isotope. It's a non-radioactive isotopic tracer. And this amino acid is slightly heavier than other amino acids. So then we're able to pick it up in different areas of the body, as well as in the breath. So with our indicator amino acid oxidation technique, that's actually what we're looking at. Is we're looking at how much of this tracer, how much of this amino acid is being oxidized, and through that we are actually able to determine what is the maximum amount of protein that the body needs for tissue synthesis. And that's not just muscle, but a lot of it is, especially after following exercise training. And then there's other techniques that are used in our lab and other labs that look at protein metabolism. There, a number of years ago, nitrogen balance was one of the main techniques used. However, that's been developed over the years now with more sophisticated techniques, like using other types of tracers, whether they are infused, so through the blood, or ingested in a drink, or recently right into food. So it's, instead of giving the tracer to infusing it to humans, it's infused into an animal such as a cow or a chicken, and then the tracer ends up in the meat or the eggs, and then you're able to see the effect of the whole foods, which has been an area of interest in the protein metabolism.
Yeah, that's Luc Van Loon's lab, I think, correct? And there's probably a couple others now too.
Yeah, Luc Van Loon has been doing quite a bit, and Nick Bird from
some Stu Phillips grad students.
Exactly.
Yeah. So if we go back up in time a little bit, like, what was the theory of nitrogen balance? Like, how did that work? And obviously the giveaway is that protein is unique because it has nitrogen, but give us a little background on that. So if people read something and go, oh, nitrogen balance versus, oh, look at all these crazy tracers, like, kind of, what's the pros and cons of that?
Yeah, so as you mentioned, protein is unique that it has nitrogen. So the only way that nitrogen really makes it into the body is through protein, and then the nitrogen coming out of the body is from the protein being broken down. So if we take the nitrogen in and subtract the nitrogen out, then we are given what our nitrogen balance is. So if somebody is taking in more nitrogen but excreting out less, then that would be said to be in a positive nitrogen balance, meaning that they are retaining more nitrogen than they are excreting, which is often what we're looking for in athletics, as that's a sign that we're growing tissue of some sort. For our strength athletes out there, that would be the myofibrillar component of the muscle. So that would be what actually allows our muscles to contract. And then for endurance type activities, that would be the mitochondrial fraction primarily, so allowing us to resist fatigue for longer, give us better endurance.
So we wouldn't be able, on a nitrogen balance, we wouldn't really be able to differentiate those two then, is that correct?
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. Because it is a whole body technique. So if you want to know what's happening in the muscle, you have to study the muscle. So if a study is looking at whether the myofibrillar component is anabolic, or the mitochondrial, or others, then you actually need to take a biopsy of that muscle to find that out.
And nitrogen balance, then, because you're looking at all things are excreted, you have to play with urine and poo, I would imagine, to do your collections, correct?
Yeah, well, luckily there's some studies been done in the past where they did look at everything from urine to feces to sweat to skin losses, and we found that it's primarily excreted through the urine. So what most studies will do is they'll just estimate those losses, which can actually be a limitation of the
Sure.
technique, but they'll estimate those other losses and just take the urine.
Got it. So if we have someone read a study that says someone is in a positive nitrogen balance, we're like, okay, so they're in a quote anabolic environment. They're probably adding some component to make them a better endurance athlete or to make them a better strength trainer, that type of thing. But we don't really know where it goes, right? Because obviously the gut's gonna, pull up some nitrogen. We've got other tissues that are going to be growing and changing over. So if we fast forward to more of a tracer technique like your lab is using, what is the benefits of that? I think you mentioned we can look directly more at muscle and maybe some of the subcomponents there instead of just a whole body level.
Yeah, exactly. So you can take you provide the tracer through whatever means. Uh, much of our lab uses much of our laboratory studies use oral consumption. So
Oh, so you don't have to use an IV now?
there are studies that do, and we actually Michael Mazzulla is a student in our lab. Uh, so he's a year ahead of me, so he'll be wrapping up his PhD soon. They're a little delayed because of COVID.
Sure.
He recently was looking to validate another oral technique, another oral tracer technique against or with using an infusion protocol. So we
Hmm.
have used infusions in our lab, but we primarily use oral consumption. Um, in a lot of cases, well, first of all, it's less invasive, so
Yeah.
it's easier to find participants.
Yeah.
Uh,
Nobody likes
not
having
that,
multiple IVs started on them and then do max exercise and a bunch of other crazy shit. So,
yeah, not that muscle biopsies don't scare a few people off as well. Um, but that's part of the reason. And then the practicality of it, the application, where much of our protein is coming in through dietary sources. So we like to study it that way when we can. And of course, that's why these whole foods are coming to become so, or are becoming so popular. And then what we can also do, what we often do in our labs, we use a crystalline amino acid mixture. So we can we take the powders of all these different amino acids and we mix them to create the profile of certain proteins. Commonly used one in our lab is egg because it's a commonly consumed protein source of high quality. So we will mix these different amino acids to um, mimic egg protein, and then mixed in that amino acid profile is that one tracer amino acid that we can then trace throughout the body. And just using this one amino acid is is effective when looking at tissue synthesis because we know that you can't synthesize tissue without all of the amino acids. So if the tracer that we're using is ending up in the muscle, then we know that those other amino acids are as well.
so is it true that you can get by with just essential amino acids, or do all of them kind of play a role? So if you were to label kind of a non-essential amino acid, does that kind of give you skewed results because it may, I guess for a lack of a better word, go somewhere else, or do all of them kind of follow the same path so it doesn't matter much?
Well, it does depend on your diet because some of these amino acids can become conditionally essential. However, from a lot of the research that we've seen, and this is actually another kind of recent area, is looking at can we get away with less of a supplemental protein if we're using essential amino acids rather than whole proteins. Um, and I would say that they're about equally effective in most cases, especially if you're just supplementing with it. But of course, that's not how it occurs in whole foods. We are in all of the amino acids, but certainly the essential ones are the signals for a lot of the protein targets in our body. So for a lot of tissues to be synthesized, so those essential ones are of the critical importance.
Got it. So walk us through kind of how that works. So if I was a volunteer of a subject, let's say in one of your studies in your lab, I come in, I sign my rights away. Obviously, it's IRB approved, all that fun stuff. I'm okay with biopsies and drinking weird stuff and stuffing IVs in me. Like, what do I do after that? Like, what kind of, I guess, exercise protocols and what are things that you're looking at? Because I think this is something that gets missed a lot of times and sort of misrepresentative by the research, both even a pro and a con, I guess you could say.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, we look at all different, different kinds of exercise. We do studies with resistance training, we do studies with endurance training. Mind you, it's rarely that we mix the two. So, I mean, we've done studies that have simulated kind of a sports environment, or sports stimulus, um, using a certain running protocol that is very similar to a soccer match. But as far as mixing resistance and endurance, that doesn't happen too often. I mean, I think, protein metabolism is still really in the early stages, in the young years, and we're still kind of mapping out the effects of endurance and resistance alone. And we do look at both in our lab. We have had studies with endurance athletes. We've had studies with resistance athletes. We've had trained and untrained. And over or two types of different studies, I guess, that would make a difference too, is that it's either acute or it's chronic. So it's either an acute study or it's a training study. And they both have their pros and cons. We often start with acute research where we're looking at a single bout, for example. So if we were looking after a single bout of resistance training, what is the effect on muscle protein synthesis or whole body protein synthesis? Whereas a training study would follow this. So if we see that after an acute bout of resistance training, so you work out once, and we see that your protein requirement is enhanced for the next 24 hours. All right, so what happens if we give this group that amount of protein compared to the RDA or some other amount of protein, right, over time? Does it actually result in enhanced strength? Does it actually result in enhanced hypertrophy? And those studies are, of course, more costly.
It's expensive.
More time consuming. So that's why they often
also
follow up
pain in the ass.
Yeah, and they often require more biopsies.
Oh, yes.
So if you're trying to limit the number of muscle biopsies, I would go with the acute studies.
And you don't want people to drop out either, because depending on how your stats are set up, you could run a long chronic study and have, more dropouts than you think, and now your stats aren't relevant. You got to figure out what to do with that. And there's a lot of pitfalls to doing it, because I think on the internet people are just like, oh, this is just an acute study, it doesn't mean anything, why don't they do more chronic studies, that's what we need. It's like, you probably have no idea what goes into a chronic human subjects study, especially when you involve tracers, exercise, biopsies, all this other stuff going on. That's just my pet peeve.
Let alone finding the funding for those.
Yeah, let alone someone's going to pay for it. They're not cheap.
Yeah, definitely.
So is it true to say that the acute studies are primarily set up, and Stu Phillips said this too, that we've got so many different protocols and so many different things we can look at. We don't have unlimited money. We don't have unlimited time. We don't have unlimited subjects either to run all these chronic studies that we want. So we're going to say, okay, I think this protocol, this protocol, this protocol, we think these are going to do positive results. So let's do an acute study first and see, does anything happen? Do we see a spike in, protein synthetic response or whatever we're looking at? If we do, and this is repeatable again, okay, now we have some original acute data to say, let's take this and then do a chronic study and see if the acute actually matches the chronic study, instead of trying to guess at which chronic studies we think are going to be the most useful.
Yeah, exactly. I would totally agree with that.
And then, do the acute studies always match the chronic studies then?
Yeah,
I know it's a big point of contention, so I'm trying to set you up here.
Yeah, No, not always. And I know that we might get into a little bit about the differing number of meals or feedings in a day, and that's effects on muscle protein synthesis and muscle related outcomes. And certainly, that's an area I've been putting a lot of time into recently, so I've done a lot of reading in it. And that's exactly what you see is you do see that the acute studies show very similar results as far as finding that muscle protein synthesis is enhanced with having multiple feedings throughout the day because of the dose response of muscle protein synthesis. So having the optimal dose in a meal, having that more times throughout the day rather than a very large bolus of protein, which is suboptimal as much of it can be oxidized, is what we've seen. But if you look over time and you compare groups that might do 1 or 2 meals per day to 4 meals per day, or having a skewed intake where they're not achieving optimal amounts of protein in a meal at one point in the day, and you again compare those over time, that the results aren't necessarily as homogeneous. They do tend to differ a little bit, and part of that is because how difficult it is to control things over that period of time, right? So there's a lot of things that are going to be influenced here. Genes, of course, for one, their sleep routine, right? How that can be potentially affected, stress, all these different
review
things.
on sleep that said that might be a huge explanation of why some people gain more than other people, and it's something that's not typically controlled in a study.
Yeah, exactly.
I diverted you off the topic there, so.
No, that's a really great example of that, though. Yeah.
So you were saying that not always the acute and chronic things match, and that maybe because in the chronic study that there's other factors that we're just not accounting for. And for the listeners, like, these are free living subjects, right? They're not hanging out in a metabolic ward or hanging out in the university for weeks and months on end. They come in, they do their thing, you get your data, and they go back to their quote unquote normal lives too. So there's a bunch of things that they could be doing. Granted, you're trying to control for as many of them as possible, but at the end of the day, they're free living subjects, and humans will do wacky stuff too.
Yeah, and it's hard to tease that out of whether there is the connection between the mechanism that we see, like muscle protein synthesis, and hypertrophy, because in certain cases there may not be, right? So we certainly see that, especially right down to the mechanisms of mTOR, where we'll see that some of the metabolic pathway of mTOR is stimulated. mTOR itself is stimulated, but that doesn't necessarily result in enhanced muscle protein synthesis over another protocol. And then sometimes you see enhanced muscle protein synthesis, and that doesn't result in enhanced hypertrophy. And there's all these other factors that can be influencing these results. So it's hard to tease out, how much of it is the control that we have and these other variables, and how much of it is that that there actually is a bit of a disconnect between the mechanism and the outcome, just to make things a little more complicated.
Yeah. And I think part of it, correct me if I'm wrong, is that you're dealing with something that has a relatively small effect size. I think it was Luc Van Loon's lab that he did an estimation from some of their studies of, okay, in a perfect analysis, you take 20 grams of whey protein and we label it and we figure out, do all this math, and okay, how many of those grams of that 20-gram scoop of protein actually end up in muscle tissue? And I believe it was like 2 grams. And there's a bunch of assumptions that go into that. And let's just say that's correct. Maybe it is, maybe it isn't. But if you do that, let's say 4 times a day, you're talking about 8 extra grams, and maybe a perfect world, deposited into your muscle tissue like a per day basis, right? So you're talking about something that definitely is a real thing, definitely happens, but it's so small too that we're trying to assess hypertrophy changes, which are hard, I think, even to assess. There's another review that came out like a year ago that's like, Well, none of even the hypertrophy data agrees, right? Are you looking at fiber type? Are you looking at whole body MRI? Like, what are you looking at to say what is even really hypertrophy, which we can't even
Yeah.
agree on?
Yeah. Yeah, certainly. And, it really surprises people how little muscle tissue somebody gains over a period of time of resistance training. So it's very small. It's, milligrams per week.
Yeah,
And even though our protein requirements are double, so tripled from the RDA, depending on,
sure.
volume and how trained somebody is. And part of that is that there's a turnover of protein, so that's very important. So replacing the protein that's already there with the protein that we basically just ate. So that's part of remodeling. It's part of ensuring that our in muscle tissue that it's of high quality and basically fresh in a sense, that the contractile proteins are functioning at their optimal capacity. Same with the mitochondrial components. Um, and then so that's an important component of it as well. So, and then part of it is also just stimulus of the protein itself. It's telling your body we have these proteins, they're available, so we can use them for things like tissue synthesis.
Yeah, and then you add on top of that, you're doing some type of stimulus via exercise, right? So there's been obviously some just feeding only studies done, but we know those aren't really, I hate the word optimal, but they're not as good as someone who trains. This makes sense to anyone who's listening, right? They go, okay, well, if I just wanted to get bigger and get gains, then I just need to eat protein. It's like, well, yeah, that's going to help, but everybody knows you need to exercise and apply some stimulus to the muscle. So now you have the argument of, okay, let's do some type of nutritional intervention. How many calories do we have? How much protein should we have? Oh crap, like what program for exercise should we do on top of this when we're trying to design this quote unquote perfect chronic study?
Yeah, certainly there's a lot of variables that go into it. Um, and that is always something really important to remind the listeners of too, is that we can talk all day about protein and how much we need of that, what the dose is that maximizes muscle protein synthesis, but it comes nowhere close to the effect of an optimal training program and or a good training
Yeah, we
program.
know what you mean.
Using that
Yeah.
that word, but yeah, but it comes nowhere close to the effect of resistance training and doing that regularly.
Yeah, and this is my guess, and you may have some better data on this, that I think there's a once you've acquired protein and you're providing a pretty good stimulus, I've seen people's nutrition can be, in short, pretty crappy, and they can do okay. But I think once you remove that stimulus, especially if you add in aging and other cofactors, nutrition appears to be a lot more important. What are your thoughts on that assertion, I guess?
Well, if we're going to say more important, and we're saying more important in the context of nutrition versus exercise, I wouldn't necessarily more important in that sense.
Okay.
I would agree though that it's more important, as in the example that you gave, an older individual. Yeah, nutrition becomes more important at that age because we have to be a little bit more conscious of it. Our protein
Definitely.
requirements go up, yet our intake goes
It's
down
going
on
down.
average,
Yeah, so they're
right?
doing that.
So exactly. So it, at the same time, for those older age groups, resistance training is going to be extremely important as well to help resist that muscle loss. Same thing with diabetes, right? There's what we term anabolic resistance
Mm-hmm.
experience, where they do not respond the same to protein.
Yeah, explain what
Um,
anabolic resistance is for people listening.
sure. So that is basically where you require a enhanced stimulus to have the same outcome. So in this case, we're talking about muscle protein synthesis. Then you need more exercise to have the same effect on muscle protein synthesis. And in this case, more amino acids to have the same effect on muscle protein synthesis. That goes for people with type 2 diabetes, that goes for older age groups, and also those with obesity. So three common, prevalent populations these days. So each of these individuals is going to require a greater protein intake to get the same response as a younger, healthier individual.
Yeah, I think you may know that I think it was a Tang who did one of the original studies that compared 71-year-olds to like 20-year-olds and was looking at an acute, I think it was an acute tracer method, and found that the 71-year-olds basically needed about 40 grams of a protein bolus or a dose at once to get the same acute response as younger individuals. I think in their 20s was like 20 grams. So to your point, you almost need double. And again, we're looking at the extreme ends of the spectrum there, but it's a double-edged sword because you definitely need more protein as you age. And I just think of my grandma when she was around, like, man, she didn't really, I don't think she ever got like the RDA of protein per se, you know, and we were trying to make sure that she did, but it just gets to be really hard also.
Yeah. And being a practicing dietitian myself, in that case, is basically getting it as high as is possible for them to maintain consistently. The other thing with older age groups is that to have the same response from exercise, they need a greater volume of exercise. However, they get tired and they're not used to exercise. Many of them didn't grow up with it as our generations did. So again, it's just basically finding the most that they can do if they're not reaching that point.
But isn't all that protein gonna like destroy our kidneys though? That's what I heard.
Oh, you have to say that one to Stu Phillips, because I know that's.
I always give him a bad time about that. He's like,
yeah, yeah. Actually, there is another recent meta-analysis. The first author is not coming to me right now, but that did show again that high protein intakes do not necessarily lead to kidney disease or damage to the kidneys.
Yeah, but they will make your kidneys work more, and I think that's the assumption where everyone loses their mind. It's like, yeah, if you're on a higher protein diet, your GFR, your other markers of kidney work they'll definitely be a little bit elevated, but your markers, microalbumin, whatever, of kidney damage, in healthy individuals, we just don't see that even on astronomical loads of protein. So.
Yeah, absolutely. That logic doesn't always work. I mean, we could say the same thing that endurance exercise or exercise in general makes our heart work harder.
Yeah, I always tell people it's the same thing as if, you go to the gym or go to your lab and we just blast your biceps or elbow flexors with some eccentrics and just obliterate all the tissue there, and you do a biopsy the next day and you put it under your little microscope and look at it. You're like, holy shit, look at this. Don't ever do this. Look at all this. It's a mess. It looks like a landmine field of destroyed fibers. And then you come back, 5, 6, 7 days later, and you're like, oh, hey, it looks pretty good. Well, maybe it wasn't so bad.
Yeah, exactly. You need the studies to support that.
Yeah, and the other part people forget too is you have to look at the time course, right? So depending upon when you're grabbing data, you're going to see different things. And if you're looking at something that's new, which a lot of studies are, you may not know the time course because it hasn't really been done yet. And then you're left with, okay, I can only get subjects to come back for so many biopsies. I've only got so much money I can spend. So you're trying to a little bit guess at different time points and to see what you find, which is, again, why you need multiple studies and a consensus and not just base everything off of one study also.
Absolutely. Nutrition is still actually a very young field compared to many of the sciences.
Yeah, even exercise phys formerly, goes probably back to A.V. Hill, like 1915, 16. That area, obviously people have been studying it before then, but, as a field of official study, maybe like 100 years. There's obviously work before that point, but it's compared to other disciplines, that's really not that long a time period.
Yeah. Yeah, compared to the chemistry, physics, biology going back thousands of years.
Yeah, and I always think it's fascinating too how we're still trying to figure out stuff like even carbohydrates, right? Like a simple question of glycogen loading and the role of glycogen in muscle, and the Bergstrom needle where you could actually jam a needle in and get muscle tissue out was what, 1963, I think. So you're at
We still
about
use.
50-ish years of being able to even look at muscle to see what's going on. Now we add in all tracer and different brand newer techniques, and yeah, it's just we just don't have as much data, I think, as people on the outside looking in think that we have.
Yeah, exactly. And then now, the most recent technique in protein metabolism is the deuterated water technique.
Yeah, I was going to
So
ask you about that. What are
yeah,
your thoughts on that? I'll leave it open ended.
so it's a heavier water, has an extra hydrogen, and this hydrogen, which is again labeled, it's an isotope, will bind itself on different amino acids. So when we take our biopsies, we can see the amino acids that have had that hydrogen placed onto it. And it's a good technique to use over time because we can find a steady state of that water and the body water of D2O. And while we can take biopsies before when the D2O is first initiated and have it very carefully controlled, and then we put the participants into two different interventions, for example, and we can see at the end, does more D2O end up in the muscle of this group, or does more end up in the muscle of that group? Because if the amino acids are being synthesized into the muscle tissue with that hydrogen ion on it, then we know that's a sign of protein synthesis, and in the case of hypertrophy or taste resistance training, most likely hypertrophy.
Oh, very cool. So what about muscle protein breakdown? I believe a lot of the techniques look at more of the synthetic side or the building up of amino acids. But what about the breakdown? Because you had mentioned that proteins are constantly being turned over in the body. We're kind of adding some bricks to the wall, and then we're also kind of taking out some bricks from the wall too.
Right. Yeah. So muscle protein breakdown, part of the reason that it's not studied as often is because it's very difficult to study.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's invasive. It's much more laborious. And then secondly is that it's just not as sensitive as muscle protein synthesis. So we see rates of muscle protein synthesis changing 3-4-fold from interventions. And with muscle protein breakdown, often it's about 40 to 50% changes from different stimuli. And it's just, again, it's not responding as much as the muscle protein synthesis side of things. And what most researchers today would agree upon, but definitely not all, certainly Stefan Phillips is one of them that would say this, is that muscle protein synthesis is more related to muscle-related outcomes, such as muscle hypertrophy.
Yeah, so by measuring muscle protein synthesis, we're still getting kind of the main effect. We're not saying that muscle protein breakdown doesn't matter. It probably isn't as sensitive to the interventions of, say, protein feeding and other things that we're trying to look at, correct?
Yeah, that's correct.
Yeah. So the last nerdy question will actually give people like some practical stuff here. So Robert Wolf had a paper a couple of years ago saying that like a 70-gram dose of protein was kind of better than other doses of protein, which, I mean, that's a pretty hefty dose of protein, and the internet and everybody lost their mind about it. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, so that really it goes against some of the research that I was speaking about near the beginning of this podcast with the indicator amino acid oxidation technique.
Right.
So just to describe that technique a little bit more, is we give a high dose of this tracer phenylalanine, and then we give different doses of protein, and our protein in these studies is basically all the other amino acids other than that phenylalanine. So we can.
And phenylalanine is typically the tracer that's labeled, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah. So phenylalanine is the tracer that's labeled, and we're picking it up in the breath, so we can see that it's being oxidized. It's not being used for tissue; it's being used for energy. We want protein to be used for tissue. So as you increase the protein intake, we see less oxidation of this phenylalanine up to a certain point. And what the Wolf Lab has suggested is that there's essentially no roof to how much protein that we can consume, and they have said that they say 70 grams or more.
Right.
Right? And what they're suggesting is that what could be happening with this extra protein is that it's being synthesized into the gut, and they term it a labile protein pool, so that later, when our muscles or any other tissue is in need of amino acids, that the gut can release it into circulation. Again, there's no empirical evidence of this. It goes against what we've seen with the indicator amino acid oxidation techniques, showing that there is a roof, there's a break point to the amount of protein that we can consume. And it goes against some of the research that my supervisor has been heavily involved in, Dr. Dan Moore, that shows that the saturating dose of protein on muscle protein synthesis is only about 0.31 grams per kilogram. And when I say...
So what's that in English?
Yeah, when I say only about that, I mean for the typical male, that's 70 to 80 kilograms. We're looking at around 30 grams of protein.
Yeah.
I guess that would be 100 kilogram male. It'd be about 30 grams of protein.
Right.
Then less if you weigh less. So it's certainly less than 70 grams or more that's showing to maximize the muscle protein synthetic response in muscle. So you're not getting any additional benefit at the muscle level, and that is really some tissue that is highly sensitive to amino acid intake. So there's just no empirical evidence for that as of yet. But I know Rob Wolf is a very, very intelligent guy. He's produced some pioneering research in the area of protein metabolism. So we'll see what's to come in the years. But I would say that the main consensus among protein metabolism researchers and scientists is that they're just not quite buying it right yet.
Yeah, that's what I was fascinated by it too, because it wasn't from Bob's Your Uncle lab. It was from a pretty legit early pioneer in a lot of that work too. But like all studies and hypotheses, we need to look at what is the data, what backs it up. Maybe we'll find in a couple more years that that was kind of batshit crazy, or maybe it wasn't as far off as we thought. But I always just thought that was interesting too, because it was so different than what a lot of all the other conventional research and stuff was pointing towards.
Yeah, exactly. It's still a contentious topic, for sure.
Yeah. Cool. Are you all right if we go over for a few minutes? You okay on time?
Yeah, of course. No problem.
All right, cool. So I want to make this some practical stuff. So you're doing some research on protein and fasting. So when I came across fasting and I've actually been using some forms of intermittent fasting for about 10 plus years now. When I first came across it, I was like, no, this is crazy. What? I had read all the bodybuilding magazines. I had started reading a lot of the research. I'm like, you got to get your protein dose, every 2 to 4 hours, and, not getting protein. I'm like, oh my God, all the muscles going to fall off your body. And that was kind of my bias going into it. And of course, I read all the muscle magazines that said that's true. And even back then, there wasn't very much research at all. But the stuff I could find was, maybe that's not really that true. And just experimentally, I've tried it on many clients. There's different forms of fasting, and all the muscle didn't fall off their body. But we know exactly what you were just saying. If we're say 24 hours and we're not consuming any food, we're not having those elevations in muscle protein synthesis, because there's no protein coming in at that time. So what are your thoughts on how the protein and fasting debates?
Yeah, well, I definitely don't want to disregard the benefits of fasting in other ways. It works for some people that are looking for weight loss and they're looking for a simple means of doing so. We've seen from studies that when individuals skip meals, even that they don't necessarily compensate for it later on in the day.
Yeah.
So
Or
this
even the
can be
next
a,
day, like Krista Verde's work, where they had
yeah,
just radically slashed calories one day, and the next day they ate more, but they didn't make up for all of the calories that they slashed doing like an alternate day fasting. So,
yeah, exactly. And that's at least in the short term
correct.
of about 12 weeks
Yep.
from what you see in the meta-analyses. So at least in the short term, it can result in significant fat loss. And in most studies, it does show that it's around 5 to 10%. And for individuals that are looking to lose weight for the health benefits, such as to for insulin sensitivity, that's often what gives them the most bang for their buck. That's the greatest return on investment is that first 5 to 10%. So I definitely, I want to acknowledge that for sure. And that's not going to, and muscle protein synthesis is not going to be everyone's top priority.
Right.
Um, it's not going to result necessarily if somebody's not maximizing their 24-hour muscle protein synthesis.
You just made all the
It's
bros unhappy, so that's the number one
well,
goal,
they
bro.
might, yeah, they might. For them, they do want to maximize that 24-hour muscle protein
Yeah.
synthesis. So for others that don't really care too much, it's not that it doesn't necessarily need to be that big of a deal, right? So for maximizing 24-hour muscle protein synthesis, what we can see again in that acute literature, primarily right now, is that having this dose of protein that saturates muscle protein synthesis, so that's 0.31 grams per kilogram that I said before.
So like 30-ish grams per meal if we put like a rough dart on it for the average dude bro.
Yeah, so at least that amount, especially particularly for muscle, to maximize synthesis. We have that more often throughout the day, then we're going to achieve higher 24-hour muscle protein synthesis. Now, that comes with a caveat that there is a bit of a refractory period between each bolus of protein. So we've seen in studies where they've infused amino acids
Yeah.
at high rates for hours that even after the 2 to 3 hour mark, the muscle protein synthesis actually starts to fall. So it becomes unresponsive to those amino acids. So in the case of consuming them in dietary form, as we do, we want to maximize that muscle protein synthesis, but we want to give it a little bit of time to come down because our muscles no longer to be sensitive to those amino acids for that period of time. It's about 3 to 5 hours, depending likely on how quickly we absorb that protein. So slower proteins may need longer. Faster proteins may not need as long. And again, smaller meals may not need as long. Larger meals may need a bit longer. So if we can consume these protein-containing food after 3 to 5 hours, then we can again spike muscle protein synthesis. However, if we're going longer by fasting for longer periods of time, that's going to leave us with in the post-absorptive, what we call the post-absorptive state for a long period of time, where muscle protein breakdown is going to be elevated, as we see when in fasting subjects, and muscle protein synthesis is lower. And then if, say, somebody wanted to make up for that, they're having 2 meals or 1 big meal, such as those alternate day fasting studies that Krista Verity has pointed to, then that protein, again, only can be used up to that 0.31 grams per kilogram. Only that amount can be used for tissue synthesis, and the rest is going to be oxidized.
So if I took in a 60-gram meal of protein, I don't get like twice the response of 30 grams?
No, this is one case where that does not occur.
So more is not always better, you're saying? Got it.
Exactly.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah, very common belief in nutrition is people that just jump to, oh, if the little's good, then more must be better.
Yep.
But no, not in this case. It is better to spread it out throughout the day, again, if we're looking to maximize that muscle protein synthesis. Now, one population where chronic studies have shown an effect is in older individuals. So in these older individuals that spread out their protein throughout the day into 4 or 5 meals, that they over time do have better strength outcomes and greater lean mass retention.
Yeah,
so they don't
Patton
lose as
Jones'
much
work,
muscle
I
mass.
think he did some of that stuff, if I remember correctly.
That would, I'm not 100% sure, but that would make sense because I know he does a lot of research in older age groups.
Yeah, cool.
So yeah, I mean, again, this is likely something that's very important for certain populations, such as those that we talked about before, that may be at risk of atrophy or losing muscle. So the older individuals, those with type 2 diabetes, potentially, those who are obese and have already experienced some sarcopenia. And then on the other side, it's going to be important for individuals whose muscle mass is of critical importance and recovery. So again, remember what I talked about before, how it's not all about gaining muscle, it is about remodeling that muscle. So in the case of athletes or military personnel, where they need to recover as quickly as possible, then for them it is likely better to have those multiple feedings throughout the day. But again, we don't need like what the old bros used to say in the magazines, like 8 in a day and wake up in the middle of the night to have a protein shake. It's probably better to get a good sleep. But certainly that 4 to 5, as far as we know right now from the mechanisms in the protein metabolism research, is likely going to maximize that 24-hour muscle protein synthesis.
Very cool. Yeah, I did an experiment. Oh man, I'm dating myself. Years ago. God, probably 15, 16 years ago now, where I was reading some of the little Few Too Many Muscle magazines, and I was like, and the theory made sense. Like, oh, you got to get up in the middle of the night and, make sure you stay anabolic the entire time, because it's, at least 8 hours of you going completely catabolic. And so
Yeah.
I made up, I don't even remember what protein I used. It tasted god awful. And I put it in an insulated cup with some ice. And then the idea was, well, if you add some oil to it, that'll slow down the absorption even more. So I think I actually added like vegetable oil to it. And I would leave it, this big 40, ounce container of it in the bathroom. So I'd set my alarm for like 3 a.m, and get up and drink this in the bathroom and then go back to bed. And I didn't get crazy gains. I think it really messed up my sleep. And yeah, I actually got fatter doing that.
Yeah. No, you're not the only story that I've heard I've done that. I've done a lot of ridiculous things with my nutrition in the past. Not that one, but I've done it. That's for sure. That's how we learn.
So if I do a 24-hour fast, my thought is that from a protein synthetic, muscle centric viewpoint, let's say I do some light training, I'm probably like neutral. I'm not going to lose like a mass amount of protein, but I'm not gaining any really new protein on that day either. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I would, in short, agree with that, especially if you're training, because we know that with exercise, that enhances the recycling of amino acids. You're basically telling your body that, hey, this muscle is important. We need to use it. So it keeps it around, essentially. It makes sure that the amino acids that are broken down are not oxidized and can be entered back into that muscle. But again, like you said, you're not necessarily going to be adding either. Now, the one thing I want to mention with that is coming back to what we said with intermittent fasting, how it can naturally lead to weight loss, means it's naturally putting you into a caloric deficit, which could result in an enhancement in breakdown and amino acid oxidation, resulting in more muscle loss had you not fasted for as long or had a few more meals.
Yeah. Is there any benefit to autophagy? Is all sexy now, and we've got the whole group of mTOR haters, and I mean that's a whole.
Yeah.
Maybe we'll have you back for another podcast. That's a whole topic in and of itself. But the argument would be that, bro, I need at least 24 hours because I'm upregulating my autophagy during this time.
Yeah, well, as far as evidence in humans, this theory of autophagy it's lacking for the what the benefits are of it. Um, they are. I know that they're doing studies in autophagy in dogs now, so maybe that gets
Mm-hmm.
us a little bit closer because the closest we've got right now is rodents, which again they're for if we're looking at longevity as a benefit, rodents, the majority of them, I believe that 80% of them die from cancer.
Yeah,
So,
rodents are super prone to cancer though too.
yeah, that's what I'm saying. Yeah,
Yeah.
so rodents, the majority of them die from cancer. So that may have a different effect than in humans who with our major killer being cardiovascular disease, because cancer is the cell overgrowing and
Right.
becoming hypermetabolic, the mTOR pathway being overstimulated. And if you can slow that down with some autophagy, then you could likely get some longevity. Again, it depends on the cancer, and it gets really complicated. Now, one thing I do want to mention with that, though, too, is that that's mainly mTOR elsewhere in the body.
Yeah, there's two
Particularly
types of
the
mTOR, right? If you were to broadly classify like mTOR 1 versus mTOR 2.
yeah, yeah. So there's mTOR one and mTOR two. mTOR one is very responsive to multiple different stimuli. It's really what is sometimes considered the contractor of the cell that tells all the workers what it's supposed to do. And then mTOR2 is responsive to insulin. Um, it's primarily involved in the insulin pathway, although it's still an area of mystery, and we're discovering more about it. Now, this again, the benefits when we look at those mechanisms, they are in different tissues, not muscle tissue.
Right.
So in the case of mTOR in the muscle, we are not trying to reduce the stimulus of mTOR in the muscle. Like I said before, with that saturable dose of protein, um, it's our muscle and mTOR is very good at self-regulation. It's not going to become hypermetabolic. It does have that peak and the break point of the maximum that it will be stimulated, and it will only be stimulated for so long. So, and I guess just kind of coming full circle again is that it's not an area that we want to reduce mTOR activity. The muscle is not an area we want to reduce mTOR activity, and the autophagy, as far as empirical evidence in humans as of right now, is not necessarily present, not present at this point.
Yeah, and people forget that exercise is a great way to actually increase autophagy too. So it's not
It,
like fasting is the only magical autophagy thing out there. Like this is a, I don't want to say normalish process of the body, and yeah, we can do things to change the rate on it. And then, I mean, I'm not a cancer researcher, but from the little bit I know of, and from talking to other cancer researchers, it seems like if you have cancer, that's completely different than if you're a healthy person who does not have cancer. Like, I don't even know if there's anything. It's almost like once you have cancer, you kind of enter a bizarro world, and stuff that was maybe beneficial might not be beneficial. And I don't know, that gets into research that I'm not an expert in at all.
yeah, myself as well. I'm not a cancer researcher. I'm mainly look at mTOR when I'm looking at mTOR in the pathway. It's in muscle.
And then also, like you said, the things that we know as you age, right? So longevity, we're looking at muscle mass, especially lower body function, grip strength, the VO2 max, aerobics are probably your top three. And we know that if you start losing muscle as you age, become sarcopenic, that is a risk factor for longevity, right? We've got a lot of data to show that the more muscle you can hold on to as you age, that's definitely a beneficial thing. And yet we're arguing about these potentially hypothetical potential benefits that are not really proven yet. But I don't know. I think there is a role for fasting. I think it can be useful, but I get super worried when people go apeshit down that pathway and potentially cost them muscle as they age, because we know that's not going to benefit them.
Absolutely. Yeah, I would 100% agree with that. And if anybody is doing fasting, they should watch their strength, watch their muscle, that it doesn't atrophy. And I would definitely caution those populations that are already at high risk of atrophy and older individuals from using a dietary approach like that.
Cool. If you were to translate an amount of protein that people should get per day, someone who's middle ages, they're not in the elderly population yet, so those people probably need a little bit more. What would you give them as like a total amount of protein they should try to hit per day? They're trying to maximize body composition, trying to add some lean body mass, add some muscle.
Yeah. If they're an active population, I'm going to revert to a friend of mine, Rob Morton's meta-analysis, meta-regression. Excellent study.
Well done.
And also many other studies to support this. Even our IAO research supports the intake of at least 1.6 grams per kilogram for daily protein. And then if I could just add one thing on top of that, it would be to try and spread whatever your protein intake is throughout the day. So try and hit that 0.31 grams per kilogram in each meal or snack that you do consume. Whether you're intermittent fasting or not, try and hit that at least at every meal. And if you are consuming the whatever protein intake, if you're consuming under 1.6 grams, it is going to be helpful to spread it out.
Yeah, and I think if I've told people like about 0.7 grams per pound of body weight it's about the same number, right? If you have a 100-pound person with the metric numbers from the study, you're at 160 grams, so you're within the ballpark. And there's some earlier chronic studies that support that, but they're all within the ballpark of each other. One of the things I've told people to do is just a simple 4x40 approach. Get 4 meals at least 40 grams of protein. What are your thoughts on that?
I totally agree. I think that's a great way to both make sure you're getting that 0.31 grams per kilogram. That's going to be more than enough. If somebody's even plant-based, then their needs are a bit higher. We're looking at about 0.4 grams per kilogram. So in most cases, that 40 grams is going to maximize muscle protein synthesis for them as well. And then the satiating benefits of protein can help us keep in energy balance whenever we're trying to maintain weight, rather than accidentally gaining weight and over consuming calories. So by having that adequate protein in each meal, then we're also reducing our risk of overconsumption of calories.
Cool. Awesome. Last question. I asked Stu Phillips this question too, but I'm always amazed by how physiologic systems work. Do you think that trying to add lean body mass, that it's human physiology is just kind of asymmetric, meaning that we know if we chuck someone into microgravity and put them out on the space station and they don't do any countermeasures, because we've reduced gravity even on their system now, they just lose muscle mass and bone like crazy because we've removed even gravity from that. They have to spend a lot of time doing countermeasures to simulate gravity and to simulate loading. So we know that if you put them in an environment where that's removed, 3-degree head down tilt bed rest studies, things of that nature, they tend to lose muscle mass relatively fast. Again, we can mitigate some of that with nutrition and other interventions, which they've looked at a lot. However, if we go to the other end of the spectrum, we've got, Dude Bros 65 from the Bodybuilding Forum, who wants to absolutely maximize lean body mass gains naturally per year, maybe after your newbie gains, you're looking at 6 to maybe 10 pounds on the high end, like per year. And that's going to be a diminishing
Very high end,
return very fast.
yeah.
What are your thoughts that it just seems like we're kind of wired to almost want to lose more body mass or lean body mass than to gain it?
Well, I would suggest that it's more so a modern day phenomenon as far as losing body mass. I think that our body is potentially protecting ourselves from gaining too much muscle mass to the point where it could be debilitating or just isn't necessary, which prevents us from gaining very quickly, especially after those newbie gains. Uh, but when I say that it's a modern day phenomenon, it's that for most of us we're sedentary during the day with the um, with computers, televisions. We've become very sedentary in the Western world, and that is the primary reason that we are going to be losing so much muscle mass with time. Of course, there's those other factors with aging, like becoming desensitized. I think that's just, just, I guess, throwing out there that I think that's just that part of aging, things start to break
Not
down.
work
There's
as well.
yeah, a lot of things just desensitize, and that's one of them. We just require more. But I think that if we were to be more active throughout the day, um, than like maybe our ancestors were, then we wouldn't experience as much sarcopenia. We wouldn't experience as much muscle loss over time. There's even research that shows that as early as the age of 23, they've seen individuals start to atrophy, right,
Wow.
if they're sedentary. And then recent research in our lab, now this is unpublished, but we did a recent study that looked at very minimal effect of exercise when sitting for a prolonged period of time. So we had individuals come into the lab and they make a work day where they sat at a computer for 8 hours, and they either sat for the entire time, or they did walking every 30 minutes for 2 minutes, or they did body weight squats for a minute every 30 minutes. And the individuals that got up and exercised showed enhanced muscle protein synthesis,
Hmm.
greater remodel, greater use of those amino acids, likely protective over time of this loss of muscle mass.
No, that's fascinating because I know I kind of asked you a leading question, but I tend to agree with you, and especially as I'm getting older and the more I learn about exercise, that we know that elderly people are still very responsive to exercise, especially with strength gains, and that they don't ever. It's like the human body never really loses its ability to adapt per se. It's just what the heck are we adapting to? And I remember, John Berardi saying years ago, people were writing in complaining. They're like, well, why am I getting fat and I'm not getting as much muscle? And I exercise 3 days a week. And he's like, you walk like 3,000 steps a day. You sit on your butt at a computer for like 10 hours a day. And then you go exercise and try to kill yourself. Right? So you see like no activity, massive spike of activity, no activity, no activity.
Yeah, even the activity levels between teenagers and those in their 20s is profound.
Hmm.
The younger individuals are much more active throughout the day than adults are.
Yeah, and I've even noticed that on something that's very simple, like just even caloric burn. If I take a vacation, I'll go kiteboarding, I'll go ride for 3 hours at a time, usually do some exercise in the morning or evening. And, maybe I eat a little bit less, but I also drink beer and eat Pop Tarts on the beach too. And pretty much every time, like, I lose weight. And it's because I'm way more active probably doing that, even than when I'm at home. Now it's like I kind of have to watch how many steps I have. Usually do some aerobic stuff in the morning, usually lift in the afternoon. But the only reason I came to that conclusion was I found that the more kind of off days I had, and a lot of work I do is online, especially now, it seems like I have to do more work to kind of counteract that also. And it just, yeah, it's just fascinating.
And so, one thing to look for, Dr. Mike, and something that I've noticed anecdotally is that when individuals work more activity into their day, it also just gives them less time to snack. It gives them
Totally.
less time to consume
Totally
calories because they're
agree.
too busy expending calories. So that could
Yeah.
be a factor playing in as well.
Yeah, and you get into the whole mitigation of stress because I can tell when I'm don't move enough, my stress goes up, and I find myself like opening the refrigerator door looking for where did I hide the cookies? It's like, am I really even hungry now? It's like, no, I'm just trying to biochemically modify my mood because I'm seeking energy. And so, especially if I'm trying to get leaner, I try to rewire that to, okay, I'm just going to go walk around the block, or I'm going to run up and down the stairs, or I'm going to do something else to use a biomechanical intervention instead of a biochemical one all the time, if that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. Um, just with the stress relief thing, sometimes it's replacing the stress that has negative outcomes or replacing stress relief actions that have negative outcomes with those that have positive. And exercise is one of them, especially low intensity exercise is very effective for relieving stress.
Yeah, I think low intensity exercise has gotten a very bad rap, and I think it's because especially people in the physique community definitely abused it for trying to just burn calories. And one thing, if
Mm-hmm.
I could go back and turn back time maybe 15 years ago, I actually would have done more aerobic training because I just noticed, even with clients now too, and myself, that we had the whole lockdown thing here, and I'm sure you guys did too, that I just said, okay, this is a perfect time for me to do like 60 days of some aerobic base work like every day. I'm not going anywhere, I'm not traveling, and I felt quite a bit better after doing that. And I forgot, if you don't do it a lot, how much it just slowly kind of creeps away. And the things that I noticed the most were not so much body comp, but just overall energy during the day was much better. And my brain worked so much better. Like I could concentrate for long periods of time again. I was like, holy crap, how did I forget that I lost this?
You sound exactly like what I've been telling people while being in isolation. Uh, since the start of COVID and things shutting down here, instead of going to the gym and lifting and not doing very much cardio activity, I don't know, I think I was lying to myself that I was doing enough, but it
Yeah,
certainly wasn't enough.
I did that.
Now I've been doing these boot camp videos. My sister's a boot camp instructor, and now she's got put it completely online, like boot camp fitness group class instructor. And my aerobic capacity has gone up substantially, and I feel great. I feel a lot better. I definitely I would echo all of those benefits that you mentioned.
Yeah. Awesome. Well, thank you so much for your time today and all the great stuff. I really appreciate it. I know you also work with clients. Also, is that correct? You have a business coaching?
I do, yeah. Hold coaching very close to my heart. I love converting science to practice. And if you're looking to find out a little bit more about me, would like to receive some coaching or just see some of my other content, you can find us at www.unlockedfitnessandnutrition.com.
Awesome. Are you taking any clients now, or are you kind of full up, or just depends on what they're looking for?
I am taking clients right now. I've been kind of laying low recently, and I'm going to lay even lower with starting my PhD thesis project soon. I will be focusing just on the thesis project and coaching. The rest of my business is kind of going to lay dormant for that time.
Ah,
Mind you, I
wise move.
love coaching. Yeah, exactly. I love coaching. I love dealing with clients. So if anybody's looking to inquire, I offer a free call and be happy to help somebody through their journey through a coaching process, even during this time when my business is kind of on the down low. But after I'm done, it's going to be full force, and I'll be putting out lots of content, more podcasts like this, and advertising, promoting the business a little bit more.
Cool. Awesome. Well, thank you so much. It's very rare to find someone who's got a lot of academic background who understands the research and is also able to translate that into what actual clients' needs, even just we've had other chats about stuff beyond just protein too. So it's super awesome to see. And if people are looking for someone, I'd recommend that they hit you up for sure.
Thanks, Dr. Mike. It's a real pleasure to be here.
Yeah, thank you so much for all the info, and it was fun to pick your brain about all the cool new research that's coming out. And thank you so much for sharing everything. We really appreciate it.
Awesome. Thank you.
Cool. Thank you. Thank you so much for listening to that episode of the Flex Diet Podcast. Greatly appreciate it. Huge shout out. Thank you so much to Eric for all of his time there. I really appreciate it. If you're looking for nutrition information and even exercise, he does do some private one-on-one client work. So I would recommend that you hit him up there. He came highly recommended by my good buddy Ted Rice from Legendary Life Podcast, which I recommend his podcast also. So thanks again to Eric. Really appreciate all the time, all the knowledge, and him freely sharing that with everyone here. If you want more knowledge in the nutrition and just a little bit in exercise and recovery, check out the Flex Diet certification. Go to flexdiet.com and you'll be able to hop onto the newsletter there via join the waitlist at the top, and you'll be notified the next time that it opens, in addition to lots of daily email content for you regarding how to get better body composition via nutrition, recovery, increased performance, and to be able to do it all without destroying your health in the process. Thank you so much for listening. Any thoughts, comments, reviews, please post them. I love that. That helps drive the show so we can get other guests and we can just keep growing and spreading the good nutrition word regarding fitness. Thank you so much. Talk to you again soon.